Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm very excited to see so many people interested in plants. I'm very happy also to give a talk after Natasha Myers and Michael Marder because I hugely admire their work. So this is really very exciting. And I have, well, it's an illustrated presentation. I'm going to be showing you a couple of film clips and not only that. So this is part of an ongoing research, and I'm a film scholar, so I'm going to be talking like a boring film person. I'm going to start with a sort of very general overview, and then I'm going to move on progressively to this sort of filmic anthology around the idea of plant sentience. I'm not going to really be talking about gender today, but it's really a dimension that I'm very interested in. So after the animal turn, a vegetal turn seems to be currently sweeping different fields of knowledge and creation. In the age of the Capitolocene, at a time when life on Earth is going through an unprecedented crisis, plants and their singular life forms, so distant from our own, seem to capture the imagination. Suddenly, books on the hidden life of trees become bestsellers, and philosophers like Michael Marder invite us to think with plants. And artists have started to manipulate microalgae or spinach cells. And this is an image from a French artist called Léa Giraud, who does photographs with algae. Anthropology has opened up to forests, and on biology's side, the idea that plants are complex, sentient beings capable of feeling to others and of communicating has gradually imposed itself and no longer raises the eyebrows of the most conservative botanists. And this is just a sort of overview of the many books that actually suggest and seem to confirm scientifically that yes, plants are intelligent. In a way, these extremely different approaches echo a much larger enterprise, that of questioning the tenets of modern thought, as Philippa was recalling in her introduction, of thinking beyond nature and culture as a simple dichotomy, of questioning the exclusiveness of intelligence as a human property. And this is a very interesting book by an anthropologist called Jeremy Narby about this idea of intelligence in nature, also about plant intelligence, obviously. So the purpose of my presentation today is not to map out this very varied vegetable turn. In a sense, I might even be questioning the very idea of the turn, if by turn one understands only a sort of teleological rupture, indifferent to the fact that all histories possess an archaeology and that narratives are never linear. If it seems indisputable, at least to me, that the debates on plant life have reached today an especially attractive turning point, to question the way in which film has been imagining and allowing its spectators to imagine plant sentience and plant agency from its beginnings in the late 19th century to today is to acknowledge that certain contemporary statements actually have a much larger history and longer history. My point is that the negotiation of ideas of non-human agency and sentience was not limited to the well-determined borders of science. Although in a discontinuous, implicit, and sometimes frankly unusual way, the plant sentience and plant agency hypotheses were also constructed and explored by a domain very often ignored by hard and soft sciences alike, the world of film and visual culture, where the scientific and the popular imagination constantly fuse and combine, creating sometimes a bizarre offspring. And I'm only quoting this because we are in London, and maybe you know this film inspired by a book called The Day of the Triffids. I'm actually not going to be talking about this, but this is some of these bizarre things that we sometimes see in film. So by focusing on a number of very different examples, ranging from early scientific films to B-movies from the 1970s, my presentation today will try to understand how cinema envisaged the hypothesis of plant sentience, so sentience being the quality of being able to experience feelings. More importantly, I wish to suggest that at least in visual culture terms, the sentient plant is in many ways a mediated plant, a plant interceded or facilitated by visual and other technologies, and actually sound is extremely important. So I think my approach is a sort of weird history of science in a way. And before showing you some film clips, I actually would like to introduce two topics that seem to be important for this discussion. The first is film's inherent animism, so the idea that it animates the things of the world. And the second question is the problem of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism. And so I'm going to start by evoking animism. And I'm going to start by showing you this video installation by a Brazilian artist called Katia Maciel. And we see a breathing tree. So on a large screen, the branches of a tree contract and relax in loop against a surprisingly still background. The tree resembles a large, leafy heart. Instead of being agitated by the wind, it has found a breath of its own, becoming visibly animated. It inspires and expires, moved from within by an internal cause. This is all the more suggestive since, as philosopher General Ecology summarizes, and I quote him, plants are the breath of all living things. They are the world, come breath. To say it with an old-fashioned word, this tree has found a soul. For what else does it mean to animate or to become animated, if not to give or to be given an anima, a soul, from the Greek anemos, the breath. So I could spend my whole presentation talking about this, but what's interesting for me, it's the way that this sort of, well, this video installation encapsulates film's inherent animism, relating both to its specific appearance mode, the famous movement of and within images, and its capacity to animate or reanimate the beings and things of the world. But I will cut a long story short and make a single point about this video. Its suggestiveness relies on the fact that the vital breath that we witness on screen is not only the trees, but also the images. In other words, what the image represents, a breathing tree, becomes entangled with its material being, a moving image. So to represent breath, to depict life, is also to become alive as an image. And this would be extremely interesting in terms to explore if we had more time. What this video installation also perfectly captures is film's capacity to rearrange the frontiers of the living, to uncover a multitude of non-human subjects, to expose and to suggest different modes of being alive. Film critics and theoreticians remarked this very early on, connecting cinema, the child of scientific and technological modernity, the champion of mechanical objectivity, the ultimate means of capturing and possessing the world, with animism, which is a sort of big contradiction. Even when it came to the utilitarian, rationalist grounds of science film, and let me show you something while I talk, just going to, hence this is a science film from 1929. So even when it comes to these more like rationalist grounds, it's as if film images were constantly reawakening older ways of seeing. Instead of disenchanting the world, cinema re-enchanted it by imputing an interiority, as anthropologists say today, to animals, plants, objects, weather phenomena, machines, etc. Moreover, and this really was a topos of film theory and criticism between the 19-teens and the 1950s, cinema invites the spectator, again a modern subject par excellence, to renew with other ways of thinking. In other words, cinema might be the child of scientific and technological modernity, but it reminds us that we have never been totally modern, as again it was recalled during the introduction. So among the multitude of non-human subjects revealed by the camera, one can find plants and mushrooms documented since at least 1898 by a multitude of scientific, pedagogical, and other films. Towards the end of the 19th century, scientists started using a plethora of motion analysis devices, such as graphic tracing techniques and eventually slow motion and time-lapse cinematography, in order to demonstrate that apparently inert plants could move, sleep, and were sensitive. While plant motion was certainly not a secret, the use of visual media, among which we should count the méthode graphique that was popularized by Marais, allowed for a novel visualization of the processes involved, contributing in a powerful and most impressive way to the imagining of non-human life. I'm going to show you another image related to these very different apparatuses that were imagined at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century in order to trace plant movement. Progressively, the manipulation of scale, in particular the manipulation of temporal scale, in which film technology excels, obviously, as we've just seen, made visible the full range of plants' tropic movements, time-lapse images conjuring their spectators to experience the rhythm of non-human lives. And this was a little bit the invitation also that Natasha Myers made to us. Thanks to film's capacity to calibrate to apparently irreconcilable temporalities, plant time and human time, these films reveal on screen and by virtue of cinema's expressive resources, the secret life of plants. Their soul, as it was then said. Tender shoots pierce the ground in seconds, stems feverishly burst towards light, and flowers bloom in the blink of an eye. Whether in France or in Germany, the wonderful spectacle of these films appeared as a revelation, confirming the heuristic capacities of filmic images. These reveal not only the autonomous movements of plants, but also their expressiveness, what some believe to constitute a manifestation of a primitive intelligence. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but there are really many testimonials and documents from the time that attest that spectators were really impressed by these films. I'm going to read Germaine Dulac. I will not read Colette. So Germaine Dulac was a French filmmaker and critic. A grain of wheat sprouts. We feel visually the painful effort of a stalk expands in coming out of the ground and blooming. The cinema makes the spectators of its births towards light and air by capturing its unconscious, instinctive, and mechanical movements. Another two examples. Jean Epstein is a famous filmmaker and theoretician, and Raoul Heinrich Francais is a biologist. So I just want to put these two quotations in relation to one another. So Epstein writes, slow motion and time-lapse reveal a world where the kingdoms of nature know no boundaries. Everything is alive. So this is film's inherent in animism. And the plant that raises its stalk and turns its leaves towards the light, which opens and closes its corolla, which inclines its stamen on the pistil, doesn't it share the same quality of life with the horse and its rider, which, when seen in slow motion, hover over the obstacle and bow on top of each other? And rot is a rebirth. He's thinking in particular about films on mushrooms, okay? So in 1911, Austro-Hungarian botanist Francais writes, the modern naturalist can no longer narrowly limit himself to the study of plants or animals because life, in its variety, solves the problem in a practical way and does not deal with our artificial separations, our classifications between plants, animals, and men. And I'm just saying that there's actually a connection to be made between this field of film visual culture and the more scientific, obviously, field of botany. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on and talk also a little bit about anthropomorphism before showing you a number of film clips. And the question I would like to ask, in particular, if we think about the film or the small passage from Jean Commando that I've just shown you, would be, aren't these film proposals just illustrating a way of anthropomorphizing nature and plants? Isn't this yet another manifestation of that deadly sin, anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism, culminating film-wise in what Walt Disney is gonna do massively from the 1920s onwards? You can see this film, Flowers and Trees, on YouTube. I mean, it perfectly illustrates this idea of anthropomorphization. And in a way, I I want to play this for you. In a way, it's very funny because in a way, Walt Disney is anthropomorphization of plants, is kind of perpetuating something that is already present in science films. And I'm just going to make you listen to the voiceover, to the commentary voice of this 1930 film called The Strangler from British Pathé. This is the music. I should have made it shorter. But the music is important.
Some plants are born criminals. For example, the young dodder comes out of the seed case all ready for a life of crime. It has no intention of earning a respectable living, so it doesn't trouble to grow roots, but makes do with a tuft of suckers.
So, the plant borns already, destined to a life of crime. So this is something you actually find very often in these science films. So is this anthropomorphism, and is anthropomorphism about anthropocentrism? The answer is not simple. That the progressive reversal of anthropocentrism often implies a form of anthropomorphism is not in itself a contradiction. Indeed, as philosophers, ethologists, and anthropologists have repeatedly pointed out, the rejection of the ontological assumption, the rejection of anthropomorphism, conceived as a capital error since the Enlightenment, originates from an ontological assumption proper to modern thought. It was the radical separation between man and nature that excluded anthropomorphism, reduced from then onwards to a cognition problem, a trait typical of children and so-called primitive people. However, it was anthropomorphism, understood as a form of generous sociality, that made us humans. And prehistorians and anthropologists have often pointed out that anthropomorphism was unknown to the Neanderthals and other archaic human species. In our contemporary context, a form of critical anthropomorphism, as opposed to a naive anthropomorphism, the armed branch of anthropocentrism, would not only be possible but desirable, in particular if anthropomorphism is envisaged as a way of apprehending the diversity and alterity of life and the living, instead of a means of flattening and erasing that essential otherness. It turns out that film is sometimes the place where this critical anthropomorphism takes place, as its paradoxical animism reminds us of. As hinted at by Epstein and others, film, and perhaps visual culture in general, was one of the paradoxical places where non-human sentience became a phenomenological and intellectual possibility. In this perspective, I would like to evoke a number of films focused in particular, but not only, on plant motion. Although they are far from being the sole pertinent examples, B-movies were actually quite important. They actively contributed to the imagining and the popularization of plant sentience as a notion. More importantly for me, and I'm repeating myself, they suggest the idea of the sentient plant as a mediated plant. And so in the time left, I'm going to show you some film clips, and I'm going to explore this idea of the sentient plant as mediated plant retrospectively. I will start in the 1970s, and then I will finish in the 1920s. So in 1966, a polygraph expert working for the CIA hooked up a galvanometer to the leaf of a dracaena that he kept in his office. To his astonishment, Clive Baxter found that simply by imagining that the plant was being set on fire, he could make it rouse the needle of a polygraph machine, registering a surge of electrical activity, suggesting that the plant felt stress. In the years to come, he multiplied his experiments, concluding that plants could detect and respond to human thoughts and emotions. In 1979, when a botanist and physiologist painstakingly attempted to explain in the pages of the American Scientist, I will go back to, oh, what's happening here? I will comment. So in 79, when two scientists tried to explain in the pages of American Scientists that Baxter's experiments were everything but legitimate science, the damage was done. The thesis on plants' extrasensory perception had quickly spread worldwide. In 1973, Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird's bestseller, The Secret Life of Plants, popularized Baxter's findings, leaving a considerable imprint in both popular and visual culture, making it normal to play music to your houseplants and inspiring a number of records, films, and writings, including children's books. And this is where I return to this image, which comes from an encyclopedia that I had. This is the beginning of my story with plants. So this refers to the Baxter experience. Even today, biologists and botanists regret the book's impact, its beguiling mesh of legitimate plant science and New Age mystical thinking having hindered the further development of plant sciences for years. Taking advantage of the book's worldwide success, Paramount adapted it to the screen in 1978. Directed by Wallen Green, who has since renegated the film, The Secret Life of Plants included an original soundtrack by Stevie Wonder. Edited a year later as a double LP, you can see actually Stevie Wonder in the film, Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants constitutes an original addition to the list of records professing that plants react favorably to music. And this is just a sample of these records from the 60s and 70s. As for cinema, the allusions to Tompkins and Bird's bestseller pop up here and there, as in Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where not only space invaders resemble unemotional vegetable pods, but classical music is played to plants in a mud bath parlor. The same year, a thriller directed by Jonathan Sarno, The Curlian Witness, and re-released recently under the title The Plants Are Watching, goes a step further, telling the story of a woman who attempts to telepathically communicate with a plant in order to find out who murdered her sister. And I'm going to show you a short clip of this film from 1979. Oh, this is not what I want.
He's been going through her stuff.
Really?
Yeah. And he won't admit it. Now, I know it sounds stupid and trivial, but I feel like he's trying to cut off my contact with her.
With the
Contact?
plant.
No, not that exactly. I don't know.
You know, really, you're not making a whole lot of sense. What's this?
It's a polygraph.
Come again?
Lie detector. I've been reading the experiments of Cleve Baxter. He attached a polygraph to the leaves of a plant and then threatened to burn it. When he thought about burning the plant, the needle on the polygraph jumped, as if the plant could actually read his mind. It's very difficult to establish a communication.
It's true, but she will manage. At the end, she will telepathically enter in communication with a plant, and she will find out who has murdered her sister. And so throughout the film, we're going to see she's going to mobilize a number of different technologies, including photography, so this so-called Curlian photography, which is actually it's a collection of techniques that allows you to have this sort of portrait of electrical discharges around a being or an entity. And so she's going to use all of these visual technologies, and she finally manages to communicate with the plant. I don't have the time to show you the sequence in question, but you can watch the film. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint because I've got other images I want to show you. So beyond popular culture's anecdotal account, I would like to stress two important elements. First, the context in which these theses circulate and spread, among which the rise of New Age thinking. Rooted in the American counterculture of the 1960s, New Age becomes, in the 1970s, more and more oriented towards a form of mystical ecology that The Secret Life of Plants, the book, perfectly exemplifies. But one shouldn't forget the Cold War and the multiplication of unconventional experiences it entailed. And actually, you can read about this in a number of CIA reports that have recently been re-released. So, the Cold War. As a matter of fact, and this element is also essential when taking into account a number of science fiction films where the vegetal assumes uncanny contours, the indirect conflict that opposes the US to the USSR also takes place in scientific labs. Scientific teams devoted themselves to the study of more or less academic phenomena, ranging in the case of plant science from the possibility of growing plants without sunlight to that of biological communication between humans, animals, and plants. Baxter's theses were taken seriously on the other side of the Iron Curtain, at least by some, and as evidenced by not only some more or less ludicrous experiences reported in the American press, but also by films such as these two Soviet documentaries. As a matter of fact, and this is the second point I would like to stress, the first was the historical context, I believe images played an essential and versatile role in this history. In reality, Baxter's lie detector, a more complex version of the development of the méthode graphique that was developed in the 19th century, presents us as much with a heuristic problem as other former graphic devices. As we see in The Secret Life of Plants, or in the Soviet film Do Plants Feel, it are the scribbling lines methodically inscribed by tiny needles on strips of scrolling paper, their spectacular leaps, which broaden the horizon, regardless of the fact that they are based or not on solid scientific basis. So I'm going to show you just a very short clip from this Soviet film, and Mike will translate.
Опускается.
It's just about the technology. I'm
Таким же
interested in the
образом, при
technology
прохождении
that is used.
биотоков складываются и листочки. У мимозы биоэлектрические токи были обнаружены давно, но ведь это особо чувствительные растения. А как у обычных растений? Возникают ли у них биотоки при воздействии внешних раздражителей? Поиском ответа на этот вопрос были заняты ученые многих стран. Какие только опыты не проводили, какие только раздражители не применяли, обнаружить биотоки не удавалось. Экран безнадежно молчал. И только при таком сильном раздражении, как ожог, экран, наконец, зарегистрировал импульс электрического возбуждения. Это уже был интересный факт. И все-таки результаты этих исследований не удовлетворяли профессора Тимирязевской академии Ивана Исидоровича Гунара.
There's, of course, also a Soviet academic working on this. It's not only Cliff Baxter and the Americans. So, moreover, in these 1960 and 1970 examples, plant sentience is explicitly associated with the mediation of machines. Again, it's as if the sentient plant was, at least filmically, a mediated plant. A plant mediated by polygraphs and their electrode cables, a plant mediated by Kirlian or aura photography, the technique which inspired Jonathan Sarno's Thriller, a plant mediated also by the apparatus that Mr. Hashimoto conceived so that he could hear the voice of a cactus to whom his wife taught the Japanese alphabet. I mean, these sequences are very well known. They appear in the documentary made on the secret life of plants. A plant mediated, of course, in time and time again by time-lapse, which exposes, according to Paramount's off-camera commentary, I'm talking about the film The Secret Life of Plants, the pain and the joy expressed by and in plant motion. Indeed, and this is actually essential, a sentient plant is a plant that has been found to move. This is the relation to time-lapse. In particular, thanks to an array of visual devices. Which brings me to my final example, and I'm really about to conclude, but I'm going to jump to the 1920s. So, as we've already seen, in the early 20th century, critics and filmmakers marveled before scientific films that were capable of revealing the panoply of plants' expressive movements. One film in particular, Max Reichmann's The Miracle of Flowers, illustrates this idea by elevating plant tropism, the movement of plants, to the status of expressive gesture. Sponsored by the chemical corporation BASF, who wished to praise the properties of nitrogen as a fertilizer, The Miracle of Flowers is a feature-length film telling the story of a fairy named Flora who surprises a group of children plucking innocent, as it is said in the film, living beings, flowers. The fairy explains to the children that plants are alive, just like us. I'm quoting the fairy. The film then intercuts time-lapse sequences of 78 vegetal species with expressionist dance scenes where human dancers interpret and mimic nature's gestures. And so this tradition, this dance of expression that is very popular in Germany at the time is actually important to understand this. I'm going to show you a clip and cut the sound because I'm going to talk on top of it. But you can, as I talk, you can see what it looks like. So The Miracle of Flowers made a considerable impression in Germany, impacting not only film criticism but also philosophy. Both Theodor Lessing and Max Scheler discussed the film, the latter observing on a personal letter that he had, I quote, seen flowers breed, bloom and die. The idea that plants had no soul disappeared completely. And this is quoted by someone who is actually in this room, called Matthew Volgraf, who has worked very much on the film, a lot on the film, and who is a sort of worldwide specialist on this. So it could be argued that The Miracle of Flowers is nothing more than an example of anthropomorphism and the attribution of human motivation, characteristics or behavior to inanimate objects, animals, plants, or natural phenomena. In this sense, the film would not challenge, but instead reinforce an anthropocentric vision of the world, whereby every form of life must be modeled on human selves and personhoods and submitted to anthropocentric measures and perspectives. It is true that The Miracle of Flowers falls prey to anthropomorphic analogies. Still, the picture's treatment of temporal scale also introduces some interesting shifts. So we are seeing the dancers who are now reinterpreting the expressive gestures of plants. This is most evident when Flora, the fairy, after explaining to the children that they don't notice flowers' sorrows and struggles because the rhythm of their movement operates under a different time measurement, and yet, like you, they flower and fade, I was quoting Flora, grabs a girl's wrist to take her pulse. I'm going to describe a sequence that I'm not going to show you, but it doesn't matter, I'm describing it. And so what happens, the film cuts to micro-cinematographic images of human blood, which render the human body surprisingly uncanny. As an intertitle explains, a pulse beat equals a human second. Soon after, a mechanical clock starts to race, disrupting human rhythms and compressing 4 years of growth into 1 hour of screen time. In other words, the technological wonder of time-lapse accomplishes the miracle of relativizing human life rhythms. By making other rhythms of life visible, film, through the mediation of a machinic, non-human subject, the camera, is potentially allowing the human spectator to recalibrate her anthropocentric perspective and to open herself as humans to other non-human subjectivities, such as those of plants, but also such as that of the camera. And I'm going to finish here. Thank you so much.